We're here in beautiful Cumming, Georgia, in the home of Jim and Kim Burton. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation with Jim. He's had an interesting journey over the last few years. Jim's a great friend. I remember Jim probably about 16, 17 years ago walking into a Sunday school class in the coolest camel hair blazer that you've ever seen, with his perky blonde wife, who was the life of every party that she went to. And we got to know Jim and Kim over the next few years, and love their family, and just love how much they love Jesus. So Jim, you've been on an interesting journey.
Yes.
Tell us what happened a few years ago when you were mowing the yard.
Well, when I was mowing the yard, I'd run out of gas. I'm not talking about gas in the mower. I'm talking about me running out of gas. Suddenly, something that I'd done since age 12 or 13, I couldn't hardly do it anymore. Just didn't have the strength to mow my own yard. And so my solution to that was, I need to go get a gym membership and get in shape. That's what I thought was going on. But several things began to come together in 2011, 2012, including I developed drop foot, which can mean a lot of different things. I had no idea, didn't know what it was called until I asked my general practitioner one day, I'm walking funny. What's this about? He said, it's about you going to see a neurologist. I want you to, have some tests and everything. And Casey, it took 7 months. It took 7 months to get a diagnosis. And that's when they told us that I have ALS. And obviously that's a game changer, a big game changer. So we received that diagnosis just about 5 years ago. And we've just kept making adjustments as the disease progresses, trying to stay productive and engaged. And I think for the most part, God's blessed that.
So take us through that diagnosis and talk about the stages of where you are today.
Sure. Back in 2013, I had some fatigue issues, but I was convinced that nothing was wrong. You may recall at that time I had been unemployed for 2 years, had just gotten a job offer from a ministry in Chattanooga, and Kim and I were so convinced that that's what God wanted us to do, that all this testing we were doing was just to confirm that we're fine and we need to go to Chattanooga. So we were just positive about that. And so then on the Monday morning, a week before I was supposed to start, we finally had a follow-up visit at what I call my neighborhood neurologist. And at that point, he told us, something's wrong here. And he called it a pre-ALS condition. And he said, and by the way, you can't do that job. He knew what I was headed to do. So that was a game changer, obviously. I had to call Precept and tell him, I'm not coming. I'm not going to take your money. I know how hard and precious ministry money is, and I just can't do it. And then on February 13th of that year, we got a second opinion at Emory, which is the ALS clinic for Georgia. And the chief neurologist said, it's ALS. I don't know how else to tell you. It's straight up ALS. And boom, talk about life-changing. So that was, I think we received the news well. As a matter of fact, I think we received it better than he gave it. It's very interesting. Casey, you and I, we've worked with a lot of people. We've tried to help a lot of people. And, but I've never made a living telling somebody they're going to die. And when you're a neurologist dealing with ALS, you probably tell 2 or 3 people a week that that's going to happen. There were 2 fellows in the room that day, 2 women doctors, and they were standing back, arms across the chest, just bracing themselves. It was like they're expecting us to rush them or something. What were they expecting? But I could tell they were all nervous. And I finally said to the doctor, just wait a minute. My mother had Alzheimer's. My wife has had breast cancer. This is the third time I've had this discussion. Just tell us what we're dealing with. And we just started working the problem. The disease in and of itself is still a great mystery. No known cause, no known cure. And it was first identified right after the Civil War over in Europe. So people have been aware of this for a long time. Obviously, when Lou Gehrig was diagnosed with this, he only lived 2 to 3 years. His was very progressive. That brought a lot of attention to it, but there hasn't been much discussion even since those days. But amyotrophic lateral sclerosis means a lot of things, not the least of which is amyotrophic is a word that means no muscle nourishment. And you know, if you don't feed a living being, it's going to die, and the muscles begin to die. The other thing that happens is it is also a nerve disease, and the nerves begin to detach from the muscles. So your muscles aren't getting direction, so they're not getting used, so that they atrophy. And eventually, ALS patients become somewhat vegetative. Now, the good news is, from my perspective, I'm not sure the caregivers would agree with this, it doesn't really affect the mind. I'm very familiar with Alzheimer's. My mother had that, and that is so cruel. But I've been able to maintain cognition. I've been able to continue to work and think and write, and that has been a blessing beyond measure for me, because I'm wired for production. It takes a lot of adjustments. We had to move. We didn't move to Chattanooga, obviously, but we had to move. House we were in was not suitable for this disease, and God orchestrated that and brought us to a place that's much easier to live. And again, we just kept making adjustments. I was pastoring at the time. You may recall just down the road from where you meet, I was pastoring a Korean American congregation. Small congregation, but it was a blessing to me. And I stayed with them through November of that year. And finally just told them, I got to pull the plug here. You have got to make a decision. You've got to get ready for me to leave. The stages you talked about, well, at first it was no big deal. I'm walking. I was having some falls. I was usually by myself. I was out in public somewhere. No big deal. Didn't get hurt, but I'd have falls. That was before, you know, we started asking questions. We get the diagnosis. Within a couple of months, I started using the cane. And that was a big deal for me, because you're making a statement when you show up at church where you're the pastor and you're using a cane. But I wanted to avert a fall, and it was time to just make them more aware that things aren't right with me. It wasn't long before it took a couple of the guys to help me even step up to the podium. I'd already begun preaching seated. That was no big deal. And then coming off the podium, that's a little more scary than going up, because you miss that step and boom, you make a splat. But fortunately, there were no incidents, no falls in that regard. So then we continue, and then I resigned that church in November 2013, and by March of 2014, I had the chair. I was having some falls here at the house. Again, nothing that broke anything, or just hassles more than anything. I'd have to call my son at work. My wife was at work at the time, and he'd come pick me up off the floor. And so we knew we had to get ahead of this. So we purchased the wheelchair. We got a van that's suited for this, and that was the big stage. At first, I drove. As a matter of fact, when I spoke at Men's Step Up in March of 2014, I drove myself that morning. And it wasn't that big of a deal. I had hand controls and everything's fine. But within 2 years, I'd lost enough strength in my arms that it was no longer comfortable, particularly for my wife, for me to be driving. And I'd made a commitment that I wasn't going to risk other people's well-being because of my disease. So I gave that up, and that was a big step. I was very fortunate, Casey, first couple of years, I was able to garner a lot of freelance work, which was enjoyable. I enjoyed the writing. I enjoyed working with the clients. I was even to the point that I could drive all across Georgia, stay in hotels by myself, go out and eat. I did 900 miles in 1 week on my own, out doing stories across Georgia. Now, that's not even a possibility today. And probably I pushed that a little harder than I should have. But, I just kept pushing out. There's a side of me as a male, I wanted to be productive. And I was declared disabled in February 2013, but I didn't want to be disabled. I didn't want to act disabled. If I could be productive, I wanted to be productive, and I did continue to do that. That work fell off for various reasons at the end of 2015, I believe. Contracts expired, budget cuts at different places and stuff. And so my work was greatly reduced. Now by then, I'm using a patient lift to go from a chair to this, from this to the bed, and that sort of thing. And I can still type. That's good, but that soon went away. So last year, I started using Dragon, which is a voice-to-text software program, and kept writing. It was difficult to do interviews and all that type of thing, so I decided to start writing fiction. I'd read a book and go, I can do that. This guy's good, but I can do that. I see what they're doing here. I could do that. So I've written 4 in a series. Now, getting published is 50 times harder than writing a book, but I've enjoyed it. Kristen Mapes, by the way, has encouraged me along the way. And I'm still looking for a publisher. We'll see what happens. You all can pray about that. I'd love to see that happen. But in recent days, this has really hit my shoulders and my arms. People walk up to me, I can put my hand out to shake their hand, but you got to come to me. I can't go to you. Now, I can squeeze the fire out of your hand, but I can't reach out to get your hand. And I've lost a lot of use of my right hand, to the point that some days I can barely hold a spoon or a fork. And so we're to that stage now. But, what we keep doing is we just keep making adjustments. You lose this capacity, okay, let's find a workaround. Let's do something different. And I'll be honest with you, as it progresses, it's getting harder to work around the disease. But we try, and we try to keep being productive and as much as possible.
Talk about you and Kim in this process, because she's not only your wife, but she has become caregiver, and she's a nurse by trade.
Right.
So what has that dynamic been like over the last few years?
That has been amazing from my perspective, because she spent 18 years as a surgical tech, and she is very familiar with medical conditions and terms, and all about sterile field and that sort of thing. And so she's on top of a lot of this. We began using in-home nursing about 2 years ago, again, to take pressure off of her. Because the reality is, Casey, this is a lot of pressure. There's physicality to it, and there's the emotional aspect, and just the fact that you have a loved one in your home who's deteriorating every day. It's hard. And but she's been strong. And I tell her all the time, well, you've hung in here. You haven't left me yet. That's a good thing. You know, we've been married 38 years. We dated 6 before that. We've kind of grown up together. And I cannot tell you how many times I've been laying in my hospital bed looking at her going, gosh, I love that woman. I can't believe that she's hung in here the way she has. But she's my advocate. She's the one that champions a lot of the things that I need. The rest of the story is, it's a lot of stress. It's a whole lot of stress. And it wears on both of us in that regard. So I try to keep a close eye on her, try to see when the kettle's getting a little too hot, so to speak, and just whatever I can do to get her to back down and maybe take a break or whatever. When I have nurses in the house, a lot of days, she has appointments, but a lot of days she just goes. She's got to have a break from this. Kim's personality is that she's a people person. She's got to be going. She's got to be around people. She's got to be engaged, or she's not happy. And she's got to be engaged with more than one person. And right now, that's me. She needs more than just time with me. And so I want her to have that. I want her to be healthy. You know, when this thing first, when we first learned about this, you think about a lot of things. But one of the things I thought about, Casey, was I want to get through this with as little stress, maybe damage, as possible on my family. You know, I have a wife and 2 boys. And I've tried, but still, there's just, it wears on everybody. So it's a tough disease. It's not, you have to learn how to be sick. I'd never been sick. I don't know what you do.
Yeah.
I don't know, you know, but you kind of learn as you go. But it is consuming, and it's tough on her. And I encourage people to pray for her during these days. You know, when she had cancer in 2002, I was her caregiver. And, but that lasted about 8 months through the chemo treatments. It was a rough 8 months, but it was 8 months, not 5 years or 7 or 8 or whatever this becomes. So this is kind of like, it's a disease that on any given day seems to have no end. And we know it does, but you can't see it. And so it feels like it's not just robbing me of life. I think some days she feels like it's robbing her also. But she's strong. She's fulfilling her vows that we made on August 4th of 1979. And honestly, I don't know where I would be. Well, I do know where I'd be in a nursing home. If I did not have her, I would be in a nursing home, which would be miserable. But she's hanging in, and I'm proud of her.
I know you already had a tight relationship with God. There was great intimacy with Jesus. But what has ALS done to that closeness with the Lord?
Well, for one thing, God has not gotten any smaller. He's not gotten any further away. I think acute illnesses like this heighten your sensitivity to the work of God around you. You appreciate things better. You listen better. And so I've never been mad at him about this. I understand why these things happen. I've thought more about, when I was healthy, did I do enough? Did I maximize the opportunities I had? I spent 25 years in vocational ministry, and amazing opportunities. And looking back, I go, gosh, there's some things I would have done differently. And, but, everything's about the same. I know some people, when they get a diagnosis like this, their emotion of choice is anger. I understand that. I do understand why that would happen. But anger leads to bitterness. There's no healing in bitterness. So I didn't even want to go there. I think I was very intentional not to go there. I'm not mad. I am sad. I don't prefer this. But in terms of my relationship with Christ, it's as real to me as it ever has been. I think it's grown more intimate in many ways. Who else do you have to rely upon? Where else are you going to turn? We talk regularly. I do remind him that I am available for a miracle, and I would welcome it.
Yes, sir.
I volunteer.
Amen.
But at the same token, if that doesn't happen the way I would prefer it to happen, I know what Scripture says. And my first breath on the other side, I'll be sporting a brand new body. I'll have my citizenship card. I'll be fine. And so, again, I don't prefer this, but I don't think I dread it either. Because, one of the things I've learned, God has not proven himself to be a liar yet. And I don't expect that to happen. What I was taught in Scripture all of my life, going all the way back to children's Sunday school, is proven to be true. And so you hold on to those things. Those are things that were embedded deep into my soul. And so I'm not going to turn my back on those at this particular time. So I believe God was as honest when he wrote the Bible as he is today. And I believe that Christ is as active in my life in a different way, obviously, as he ever has been. And I take great comfort from the Holy Spirit and the work that he does in my life. So I think we're okay in that regard.
Tell us about life in the blue zone. Explain that.
When Kim was sick in 2002 with breast cancer, that in many ways was more traumatic for me than this diagnosis. Our kids were younger. I couldn't imagine losing her. I mean, everything goes through your mind with the cancer diagnosis. And so when she got sick, I realized that I didn't understand the biblical teaching on healing. I didn't understand how to pray for healing. And that's when I jumped into Scripture. And I jumped into it and did a thorough study. What does it actually say about healing? And there's a lot there. Pulled it together and actually put a manuscript together, and it sat in my computer until I was diagnosed. And then when I was diagnosed, I went, wait a minute, here we are, an average American family, and now we've had two, life-changing, altering diseases. So I pulled it back out, updated it. Life in the Blue Zone is about the fact that I now park in handicap parking. Never saw that coming. Never dreamt that would happen. Didn't want it to happen.
Yeah.
And suddenly, I'm one of those people. I'm parking in handicap parking. That's life in the Blue Zone. I didn't see it coming. It took me by surprise. And so we've, it's funny you mentioned that because Kim patrols handicap parking. She watches. She wants to know who's cheating. And, and she might even do a 911 if she thinks something isn't right. But Life in the Blue Zone is our story of her cancer diagnosis, followed by my ALS diagnosis. Then the middle of the book is a theological treatment in many ways of why bad things happen to good people. It's a fascinating thing. We all the time ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, the short answer is because good people do bad things, and we don't realize it. That's part of our arrogance. It's part of our lostness. We don't realize our sin. We're not sorry about our sin, but we all have a sin nature, and we forget it on those days. And we think we're due something or owed something. So we work through that and try to help people understand that somewhere along the way, you've got to accept God's sovereignty. Good can come from suffering. Good can come from illnesses like this. I'd still prefer not to be in this, but if there's good to be had, I don't want to miss it. Boy, I tell you, I go to a support group, an ALS support group. Now that's a trip. You go to a meeting in a room full of people who are dying. Does that sound like a downer? It's not. It's actually very encouraging because everybody in there has a pretty good attitude. Everybody's trying to figure it out in their own way. And we have a chance to encourage one another and minister to one another. And it's become a staple for me. That's something we want to do. It's not easy to get there. It's the biggest trip I make all month. We drive to Marietta and back. You'd think we were going to Yosemite or something. It's a big deal to go over there and do that. But I'm in a room full of people with a terminal disease. I'm one of them. Mm-hmm. And yet we find joy. And so we keep enjoying those things. The serendipity of life is so fascinating. But I can assure you that just because I received this diagnosis, I was not abandoned at all. As a matter of fact, in many ways, I feel like Christ drew closer. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, I think we're good.
What's on your heart right now? What's God showing you? What's top of mind for Jim Burton that takes a lot of his mind space right now?
Well, again, part of this I think is just being a male. And I still want to be productive. And I still, the calling never went away. Mm-hmm. I still feel called to a ministry and then using what communication gifts I have to do that. So what's most on my mind is I want to maximize the time I have through writing to just talk to people. I'm very concerned about a lot of things. The millennial generation, it's our fault. We raised them, but good grief. I mean, I'm just very concerned about their abandon of the church. I'm very concerned about their abandon of traditional morality. And even yesterday, we were listening to a story on TV. Millennials will tell you straight up, I'm entitled. Which explains to you why Bernie Sanders was so popular with him. And I'll go, wait a minute, if that continues, is that going to usher in socialism in our nation? I think about things. I have time to think about things like that. So I'm very, very concerned. I'm still very concerned, Casey, about the state of the church in America today. I think it is anemic, by and large. I know there are some exceptions out there, but if you look broadly at what's going on, I think most churches are not thriving. And that was not God's intent. Mm-hmm. God's intent was for that community of believers to thrive in the community where he plants them. And so I'm concerned about that. So my writing addresses some things like that. I've done a novel series, and the key characters are millennials who start out like most millennials, but then they encounter Christ, and it changes their life, and they do different. They become very faithful. I'm currently working on a book, Casey, that God laid on my heart years ago. Never had time to get to it. And recently I felt the Lord saying, now's the time. Go do it. I think we grossly miscalculate what happens with salvation. Mm-hmm. Most of us treat it like as a train or plane ticket. I've got a reservation to take me from one place to the other at a certain point in time, and that's great. I'm good. Well, that is good. I celebrate that. But there's a lot more with that. There are multiple dimensions to salvation, multiple gifts that God endows us with salvation. And I, in some small way, would like to spark or contribute to that conversation to help people realize this is not a game. This is not, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer called it, cheap grace. This is very costly grace. And if it cost Christ what it cost him, shouldn't I take it a lot more seriously than I do? And I would like to see America take it more seriously. And the secularization of America is alarming. I think it is to all of us. And clearly, the country I was born into is not the same as the one I'll be dying in. It's very different from my childhood, youth, and even early adulthood. So those are things that concern me. I try to write about that, write proactively to address those things, to encourage people. And we'll just see if God blesses that.
What are the 1, 2, maybe 3 things that you would say, if you only could say 3 things to men, what would they be?
Wow.
And I want you to look into the camera and get all Kentucky on them, all right?
The first thing that comes to mind is I would like to see men take their assignment as spiritual leaders in the family more seriously. Your children and your wife, your grandchildren need to see the work of Christ in your life. They need to know that your faith is real. That's one of the reasons why we're losing a lot of youth. They're not seeing faith at home. So I'd like to see you take that more seriously. Humble yourselves and dig in and model Christ to your family. Secondly, I'd like to see men learn how to better honor their wives. I think we fail in that regard. I think we fail to realize what a blessing they are. You know, here I sit 38 years into a marriage, afflicted with a terminal disease, and I understand it a whole lot better today than I did back in 1979 when Kim and I said I do. But we need to honor our wives. Yes, back in Genesis, God may have made the woman a helpmate, but in order for her to be affirmed in that, she needs to be honored. So focus on that and think about how you can honor your wife. The third thing that comes to mind is compromise. I remember as a teenager, I was active in my local church. A lot of the businessmen in my local church were teachers and that sort of thing. And then I had a chance to go work for one of them out of college. And what I saw in the workplace is not what I saw at the church house. I'm concerned about the number of men, maybe even men that attend Men Step Up or ISI, that they get it, they understand it, but when they get in the workplace, they become profane, they become excessively competitive, and there's no evidence of Christ in your work ethic. So I would encourage you to think about your place in the marketplace, the things you say, the things that you do, and how they might honor or dishonor Christ. And be willing to face to the areas of compromise. And we all compromise to some degree because we fail. But there are usually some things that we can fix pretty easily, not the least of which is our language and some other habits. So I encourage you to guard against compromise, because every time that happens, it just builds more animosity towards the church and towards Christianity as a faith system.
One of my final questions is one that is really inspired by a men's retreat that you facilitated when you did your Legacy Builders retreats. You had us write a blessing to our kids. So I want to ask it in a different way. How proud are you of Jimbo and Jacob?
Wow. Well, we are blessed. Both our boys are doing well in life. Neither one of them have been in jail for years, so I'm really grateful for that.
That's good.
Yeah,
That's a good thing.
They've stayed out of jail. And each of them have done some dumb things, but not the really stupid stuff that keeps you up at night. But bottom line is, they're doing well. They're both engaged in church, very active. My oldest son has 2 children, and even this morning I received a video of my 3-year-old singing praise songs. I like that. I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful to see how engaged my son and my daughter-in-law, who's amazing, are in the lives of these children, how well they're directing them and caring for them. It just blesses me beyond measure. Then my youngest son, he's still single, and he hauls off and moves to Nashville. Doesn't hardly know a soul up there. In 2 years, he's established himself as a vocal coach. He's coaching Emmy award-winning vocalist. And God has blessed that. He never asked for money. I like that. And he's also doing the Airbnb thing, which our generation doesn't understand, but he's booked every weekend and a lot of times during the week. He's an entrepreneur. It's amazing to see what he has done and what he has accomplished. It's a whole lot better than having to go visit him down at over in Mississippi at Parchment or, Angola in Louisiana, I thank God on more than one occasion. I thank my boys that they never did the really stupid stuff. That life-altering, life-changing stuff that so many of their peers did. And so, yeah, we've actually thanked them.
That's cool.
So they're a blessing. They bless us. Our greatest joy these days are our grandchildren. It's amazing.
I hear it's the only thing in life that's not overrated.
It's not overrated.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to me. I mean, I knew we'd love our grandchildren, but now that we have 2, it's amazing the joy that you feel welling up in your heart when I see them or around them. Kim keeps them 1 day a week, and she typically, FaceTimes with me. Just seeing them on the phone just brings a level of joy that is hard to explain. But it's something that God allows to happen. I think it's by God's design that we have that level of joy. So in terms of our sons and our daughter-in-law and our grandchildren, we think they're in a good place. We're grateful for that place. And we really, really thank God that they've stayed the course.
That's awesome.